Well, friends, welcome home. Flexible is not the way my family thinks about me. But that's another conversation. What I'm hoping to do with our time this afternoon is to walk a bit more directly into questions about leadership, because I've been describing it as having changed, and I'd like to explore that a little bit more with you. Before we just jump off into something new, what's left over for you from this morning? Are there particular questions in mind or observations you want to make? What's left over before we jump into something new?
So this has been pushing on me. How can we have a helpful conversation around knowing that we have to count stuff? Because we are one of, our conference is one of those that sends us an email every morning that says count stuff.
Yeah.
How do we move from saying I can count stuff, but we also want to be a people that wants to talk about outcomes? How can we have that conversation with our leadership? And I don't mean, you taught us how to have that conversation with the leadership in our congregations, but other leadership.
Oh, you're talking about your conference leadership?
Right.
Oh, okay. I'm tempted to say that's a good question, and then to say next question. Let me be as clear as I can just about my own experience. I can't talk about your experience, but I can talk about my own experience, and that is that when I'm working with the bishops that I work with, and particularly if I also think about the work I've done with annual conference staff and annual conference leadership teams, they are not invested in only counting. They are definitely trying to lead the way in some accountability around counting and some consistency around counting. And even more importantly, for my perspective, the use of what you've already counted. I don't know whether it's ever occurred to you, but every one of our mainline denominations has a research department that continues to do all of the data gathering, just as we do ourselves. And my experience going back probably about 15 years is that up to that point they were doing all of the collecting of the data and then very effectively doing nothing with it. We gathered data, but we never used it. And so I think that the general church and our annual conferences are very committed now to accountability around that data, because we are beginning to use it. And so I really encourage you to do that. But then, it may be in part that's what you experience the most from your conference leadership. I don't know. But what I do know is that that with the work I've been doing, this deal of setting outcomes is a big issue with the bishops that I work with, that they are definitive in terms of trying to get clear. Let's go at it this way. Basic principle here. In a growing economy, you do not need a plan to grow. You don't. Because resources are always flowing in your direction. You just do more of whatever you want to do because there's always going to be more people and more dollars. And friends, a lot of us have inherited the norms from a growing economy, when in the 50s and the 60s up through the early 90s, particularly people were flowing our direction and dollars were flowing our direction. We made very few choices, except to say, and so you'd go in the annual conference session and someone would say, well, I think it's a terribly important thing for us to support campus ministry, and everybody would vote for that, and then somebody would say, yeah, but what about, chaplaincy? Oh, yeah, we got to support that. Oh, what about prison ministry? Oh, yeah. But in a growth economy, you can have those conversations and you don't need a plan. What Friedman and Mandelbaum have pointed out is that in a shrinking economy, you do need a plan to shrink. Somebody has to say, this is more important now than that. Doesn't mean that's not important, but right now, this is what we have to do. And so one of the things I'm really aware of is how much our bishops and other leaders in our church are trying to make the very difficult decisions about what is most important now. And I got to tell you that every time that, you know, the results of those conversations come out, people are displeased because they're goring some of your oxes. That's understandable. But at least they're trying to do the hard work of those outcomes. And so what can I say? Y'all don't like them when they want you to count? Y'all don't like them when they set out the outcomes that you have to measure yourself to? I told you I'm married, I have kids, welcome to my world. This is life. This is us having to get clear. So I do want to suggest that the only thing that you're experiencing is not just this incessant counting, that there is a very rich conversation going on. Don't forget, almost every middle adjudicatory system I work with is focused on congregational transformation, leadership development, just that list of 5 things that I ran down before. They're very clear about working those areas.
I don't think we said we didn't like it.
Well, I know, but I thought it'd make a nicer afternoon conversation if I told you you don't like things. So,
are you working with any of our bishops?
Yes. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. I am. I have been historically.
Gil, could you expound just a little bit and clarify how we recognize when we have become overly relational to the detriment of focusing on purpose? I made some notes here and talked about, I wrote down something like, if we're talking about and remembering who we've been and we operate out of that, we become overly relational. Authentic community is not relational agreement, it's focused on purpose. And
right.
I got the gist of it.
Sure.
Could you say anything more about how to recognize that and name it in the congregation?
Sure. How do you recognize when your congregation has become overly relational? Turn to your tables and I want you to have a 1-minute conversation and come up with the 2 markers that if you saw them would tell you that your congregation is overly relational. So please, go ahead. Okay, that was a 1-minute break.
Yeah, exactly. That's why they...
Give me the markers that would tell you that your congregation is overly relational. What would you see?
You can't speak truth.
Can't speak truth. If the only thing you can do is agree, then you can't actually speak freely. Give me another marker.
Won't say or do anything that might cause you to lose them.
Yeah, holding on to membership is your primary objective. As a matter of fact, we're going to talk a little bit more about that. But that means that you are assumed that we are united by relationship, not by purpose. Inability to let go of folk. Give me another marker.
Want to know everybody.
What's that?
Want to know everybody.
Oh, everybody has to know everybody. Yep. Give me another marker.
Congregational care trumps everything.
Yeah, congregational care trumps everything else. Yeah, how many of you have been in that situation that someone is disgruntled and they've been disgruntled, for 94 years, and you are the new pastor and it hasn't gone too well with you either, so they suggest that you should go out and have coffee with that person more frequently so that they can then begin to see what you're doing and become a supporter. Have you had that conversation? Don't do it. Don't do it. It doesn't work. But it is pastoral care. We got to care for these people even if they've been in that no position all the time. Another one.
No, I was going to disagree with that, but
Oh, don't. I'm on a roll here.
because nobody would tell me to do it. That's what I do and build relationships with people, and then you can help nudge them along. You can't just do it for the purpose of doing it, but if you have a long-term goal in building that relationship, it can lead to overcoming those problems or them allowing things to move forward that they might have been a roadblock for.
Fair enough, and I accept that. But I will come back a little bit later this afternoon and talk to you about the people you should not listen to. Okay?
Insider language. The bulletin says, see Dave, see George.
Right, the insider language, right. Yeah, yeah. One or two more and then we're going to move. Anything else you got?
Our building is our building.
Yeah, right, right. Yeah, our building is our building, this is our program, all that. The ownership issue, it's for us, it's by us, it's for us, and so forth. And so, yeah, all those kinds of markers. And
Culture of preference.
yeah, culture of preference. What would it be like if you went back to your governing board and said, how do we know that we're not too over relational? What would we look for? And let them come up with a list of 3 or 4 things and then just let them go for a while and see how they are.
Is it possible to reframe that over relationality in terms of that's not really a healthy relationship if you never say anything. So in a healthy relationship, you are able to disagree without losing the relationship.
Sure. As soon as we go into the over relational, we're going into Friedman's glomming, that we are so stuck that we can't unenmesh ourselves from one another. And so we're not talking about healthy relationships here, we're talking about overly related, where a relationship has supplanted purpose. All right. Anything else left over from this morning before we jump? Okay, I have fully subdued the group. It's time to do something else. What I'd like to do is talk about leadership again, but to do it in a particular way. I would like to talk about leading in a voluntary association in an environment of change. And so obviously there's new language in there. It's probably not all that unfamiliar to you. But sometimes what will happen is that we are voluntary associations and we will often be reading about leading other types of groups or organizations. And so there are some characteristics that we need to be aware of when we think about leading a congregation. A congregation is a voluntary association. People are there by choice. They volunteer their association. And part of what we know about voluntary associations is that they have low thresholds and porous boundaries. It does not take much to get into a congregation. All you have to do is show up. It does not take much to get involved in a voluntary association. In a small church, if you show up 3 Sundays in a row, you're on the board. And so the threshold coming in is very low. But the other thing about voluntary associations is that the threshold going out is even lower. You don't even need to show up, and nobody will even say anything about it to you. So it's easy in, easy out. We okay so far? Okay, and so we already got into some of that earlier today, talking about relationship and purpose, and that voluntary associations have a tendency to be over-relational because of their low boundaries. If you are a leader of a voluntary association and you're concerned at all about survivability, sustainability, you will be very concerned about bringing people in to your system over that low threshold. But once they're in, you definitely don't want them to leave. So what do you do after they're in?
Please them.
You try to please them. You do everything possible to keep them happy. And so the system is built around issues of satisfaction. We talked a little bit about the preference and the purpose, that people will quite naturally in a voluntary association want to talk about preference. Now this is one of the generational shifts that people today of younger generations, and Well, we have to be a little bit careful about that, because a lot of the new faith communities that are being formed are not just being formed by millennials. They're being formed by people across all generations. But what they're responding to is that they're coming together because of a purpose, which is a very different construction of an organization. And we have inherited voluntary associations. We're trying to make them more purposeful. But we are still in a position where, among everything else, rewards focus on satisfaction. You are expected to keep people happy, or else they will simply drift away, or worse, organize. Your longer-term members will organize because that is a GI value. The GI value, and I think it's worth noting that this is not bad behavior on their part. GI values have a lot to do with that group identity that I was talking about, finding your team, being loyal to your team, and they've learned those values very deeply. So older people in our congregations that are voluntary associations, as we've been describing them here, quite frequently have this conversation where one person stands at the back of the sanctuary, and as other people come by that they think might agree with them, they'll say, "What'd you think about what the pastor just did?" Just asking. "Oh, you don't think it was good either, huh?" "Well, interesting. I think some other people probably feel like you." "Oh, by the way, we have a meeting this afternoon at my house of the people who don't like it. Would you please come?" And those are the folk that organize themselves, and they show up at the DS's office on a rented bus without an appointment. Okay? Now we see that as amazingly bad behavior. That is learned generational behavior. They know how to organize around important things, which is quite different from the GI generation that if they don't like it, guess what they do? They leave. They don't organize. They go find some place where the preference sets them much better. So in some sense, we're trying to lead organizations. And if you have a healthy congregation, one of the things that we know is that you have both the GI value system and also the baby boomer system in it. It's much harder to keep the millennial system of values in it, but at least you have two if you have a healthy congregation. So what does that mean for you to try to keep everybody happy when some people are going to organize if they don't have their preference and others are going to leave if they don't have their preference? Do you hear where we are? This is one of the hardest forms of leadership that you can actually exercise. And there's many things in that system that are kind of wearing against the exercise of leadership that would invite change. And yet we are a people of change. The thing about discipleship, we are a people who make disciples of Jesus Christ for the transformation of the world. Disciples are changed people. They are intentionally changed people. The means of grace, the various disciplines and practices of the United Methodist Church are meant to help us change. It's called moving on to perfection. And yet we have been continuously invited people into our congregations, assuring them that they will be completely satisfied. When's the last time you woke up, looked yourself in the mirror in the morning and said, "Everything in my life is exactly where I want it, so I wonder what I'll change"? Those ideas don't go together. And so, if you will, the United Methodist Church has now changed the contract of membership for people without asking for permission. And a number of the people are considerably upset by it. All right. So we're leading voluntary associations, and we're doing it in an environment of change. And this is one of the places where I really want you to wrestle with the fact that we are no longer in a linear world. Michael Fullen has written, "Many of us have concluded that change cannot be managed." I fully agree with that. That's not where I started, either in my pastoral work or in my consulting. I used to do strategic planning in a very linear way. I used to try to, invite people into ownership of what we were doing so that we could all move together. Many of us have concluded that change cannot be managed. It can be understood and perhaps led, but it cannot be controlled. The best way to manage change is to allow for it to happen, to be pulled by the concerns out there rather than being pushed by the concepts in here. This goes right back to what we were talking about earlier today, that your task is to diagnose your congregation and your field and your mission field, the setting of your ministry, so that you can be driven by what's out there. The good ideas don't come from in here. The good ideas come from the listening that goes on where people are, and to move them in that setting. And the way that this tends to go is that leadership, if you're going to lead in an environment of change, it happens quite naturally. One of the things that Fullen would say, and Fullen actually, Michael Fullen, he has a book that's simply called Leading in an Environment of Change. I really highly recommend it. He does not write about the church. He's an educator talking about public school systems and the educational system. But it's remarkable how much of an overlay between their experience and our experience there is. But one of the things that he will say is that one of the ways that leaders most effectively lead their system is by disturbing it in the right direction, not by coming up with the answer. Fullen does not look for people who have the best ideas or who are most innovative, but rather folks who are willing to disturb the system in the right direction. And this goes right to the heart of asking a better question. Questions disturb us, answers comfort us. Why is it that your congregation wants you to come back from these Financial Leadership Academy meetings with the answer? Because it would make them very comfortable to know that their church is safe again. And you'll go back with, hopefully, some questions that they haven't considered yet, which will disturb them. Therefore, it matters what question you ask, because your task is to disturb them in a missional direction, to ask questions of mission. Oh, the favorite example, I was just with Kent's class at Lancaster Theological Seminary, and we were talking about some of these same things, and I'm pretty sure I shared the story. It was just a delight. I was doing some work up in the Midwest, and a whole group of clergy, and there was one young Lutheran pastor who, after we talked through some of this stuff, came up and said, "Gil, let me tell you about what's happened in the last 2 years. I'm the new pastor of this little Lutheran church, and for 2 years we've been arguing about painting the sanctuary."
It's at Lake Wobegon.
Well, yeah, it's very close to Lake Wobegon, as a matter of fact. And so they were arguing about painting the sanctuary, and over 2 years they had not been able to resolve it. So obviously you know that if you're going to argue about painting the sanctuary, you're arguing about who gets to pick the color, and you're arguing about who has to pay. 2 years they could not solve it. So finally she got frustrated enough, and she said, I think we need to change the question. We don't ask the question, should we paint the sanctuary? We should be asking the question, who are we painting the sanctuary for? She said, because if we're painting the sanctuary for ourselves, we can move on, because we've already proven we can't make the decision, and we already know how to go to church in that color. But if we're painting it for other people, if we paint the sanctuary, is that enough to actually bring people in? Did you hear what she did? She moved the conversation from preference to purpose. She moved it from a conversation about what would be pleasing to the people here to a question that would be disturbingly purposeful about what are we trying to do where we are. And if I can simply add to that, her board was not happy with her. Do you know that there's a certain percentage of why people involve themselves in congregational conflict? There's a certain percentage of reasons that are there simply because people enjoy it. There is a very enjoyable aspect about church conflict, about any kind of conflict. We get to watch people behave differently. We get to listen to what's next. We get to tell stories and all that other kind of stuff. People will stay with some of those arguments and some of those things simply because they're so enjoyable. Yep.
So, just a question about the disturbing in the right direction and moving in the manner that's positive for the mission field, and even people's involvement in conflict because of it's enjoyable. I think that people become involved, have learned to become involved in the conflict because they know they can make a change by it. Enough conflict and enough chaos will bring about a change. So if I don't agree with the pastor, all we have to do is make a couple of those calls and visit a couple of those DSs and make enough noise, and eventually there'll be a change. So how do you lead by disturbing in the right direction, knowing that people have become very good at organizing to get the change that they want?
Are you, when you say organizing to get the change that they want, are you talking about organizing to get the change back to the way it was?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. Yep. 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 That's the reality. We're not surprised by that. And in fact, there's a little bit I want to talk about later today that, at least for me, has helped me with some insight in terms of some of the dynamics that are involved with that. Purpose and relationship. You cannot go ahead with purpose without having a relational base. Relationship is valuable as long as it has purpose. You're going to have to walk that balance and figure out where you are with it. You know, I'm going to invite you not to be oppositional with people. I'm going to ask you to disturb them with your questions. I'm not going to ask you to insist that they have a particular conclusion. I'm going to ask you to be appropriate. Does that mean your system's not going to push back? It will push back. Do you all know that one of the realities about stable systems is that the norms that have been set in your congregation have outlived the people who set them? And those norms are amazingly tenacious. That's part of what we're wrestling with as a denomination. The norms around our polity, about our book of discipline, were set by earlier people, and we are still being held accountable, even though not only have the people disappeared, but the circumstances or the situation in which those polity and policy decisions were made are already gone. They are amazingly tenacious. You all know that people who have been coming to the same church for a long time have assigned seats. And the way you figure out that your seat is assigned to somebody is by sitting in it, which obviously, as a visitor to a lot of congregations, I've done a number of times. One time I sat down in a seat and somebody came over and said, "Gil, you're actually sitting in Mr. So-and-so's pew." I understand that, so I said, "Well, I'm sorry. You know, where is he? I'd be happy to, you know, move to a different place." And the answer was, "Well, no, that's not the issue. He's been dead for 4 years." Now, seriously, literally, that's what the person said to me. Because the norms can be so we are.
Did you put your arm around him?
Did I put my arm around him? The dead guy? No. So, you know, this issue about trying to find the right way to disturb the system is a rather sensitive thing. But I got to tell you, if you go home with the answer, you're going to get less distance out of any leadership than if you are willing to walk into the anxiety of this kind of stuff. Kent.
So some of us are in 22,000 churches that aren't going to make it through this turmoil, and some of us in a third of the churches that are healthy. Talk about leading and disturbing in the right direction in relatively healthy churches. What reactions are going to be maybe similar, but different. What's different about the responses of people in a healthy environment?
The responses of people in a healthier environment, quite often, one of the things about healthy, vital congregations is that they tend to have a perspective or a purview that goes beyond their immediate preference. And so it's going to be a much easier conversation. But the fact is that it is hard for me to find congregations that are culturally sensitive. And we do have some. And in fact, the larger your church is, the more we have evidence that you are already culturally sensitive, or else you wouldn't have gotten large. Large congregations have to manage most of this stuff. Do you realize that if you go to a congregation that has an average attendance of 600 or 700 people, you've already chosen to be with a group of people that are diverse from you? There's no way to get 600 or 700 people together who are just like you. And you like that diversity. And that's one of the reasons people choose those conversations. But at no point will that congregation ask you to negotiate your differences with anybody else. All of the differences are negotiated by the pastor, the staff, and the board. And you're simply invited to be. In the healthy situations where we come up against this kind of balance is not with the congregation at all, it's with the key leaders. It's with the key leaders who are there because they've invested in some part of what the congregation is doing. And if you've got a healthy congregation, you're going to have multiple issues, multiple, commitments that people have made to that congregation, which they would like to see, go out. One of the images that is always helpful for me is to think about congregations as concentric circles. And if you will, what you've got is leadership, you've got attendance, and you've got membership. It's always helpful for me to remember that in this kind of a system, when you're talking about change at all, anxiety lives at the center. And then the farther out you go in the congregation, the more anxiety turns into simple interest. People are interested out here. They're curious about what's going to happen. But that's not where the anxiety is. The anxiety is in where the people who have the deepest commitment, the deepest investment in the congregation, and that's where most of this happens. So even in the healthiest of our congregations, you're still in that same place where you've got to negotiate the differences among your key leadership team. So, a piece of it. Okay, well, where I'm encouraging you to go here is to say that we're asking you to think about how do you disturb your congregation in the right direction by using purposeful questions, outcome questions in particular, and to accept the fact that you're going to do it by successive approximation. Linear leadership says that we are at point A and we have to get to point B. And if we don't get to point B, we have failed. Systems leadership says we're at point A and we need to move toward point B. What are our approximate outcomes? How do we start to take steps? And you accept whatever steps your system is able to do. Successive approximations. How many of you are old enough to remember B.F. Skinner? Anybody here? Okay. B.F. Skinner was a behavioral psychologist who said that basically you could deal with anybody's issues in life by changing behavior, and changing behavior had a very formal pattern to it. He was well known for what was called the Skinner box. The Skinner box was this wire cage into which you could put a white rat. For whatever reason, they were always white. And on the one end of the cage was a lever. And that lever, if it was pushed, would drop a food pellet into the cage. Okay? And so everybody knows this except the white rat. So you put the white rat in the cage, and the white rat just naturally wanders about the cage, And then after the rat moves toward the end where the lever is, the researcher has another little lever, pushes the button, and a food pellet is dropped. Catches the rat's attention, and so the rat moves around. Second time, boom, you get a pellet because he moved near the lever. Pretty soon, the rat is living on that side of the cage. Now, we've taught that much behavior, so what we're going to do now is that it's not going to be enough for the rat to live on that side of the cage. What we want is we want the rat to be aware that there is a lever in the cage. So we're going to wait till the rat bumps the lever, then boom, we're going to deliver a pellet. 2 or 3 times the rat's going to hit the lever, going to get a pellet. Suddenly, the rat is the best friends with that lever and begins to play with the lever. Now we're going to wait until the rat pushes the lever down and deliver the pellets. A couple of times, and suddenly the rat is sitting there just hammering the lever. Each one of those stages is known as a successive approximation of what you were after. One of the things about disturbing your system in the right direction is sometimes we want to disturb it too fast, too far, and not accept the successive approximations that people are able to do along the way. Does that make sense? People do not need to know that they have failed either your expectations or their own. But they do need to know that they are making progress. It is essential for the anxiety that we are creating in our systems. So, back to the tables again, if you would, friends. What is the right next question you would like your congregation to wrestle with? What is the right next question? And what would be some reasonable steps that you think that they could take in the direction of answering that question? Go ahead, friends. I'd invite you to talk about your congregations again.